1,000 new cases each day. Here in Ottawa, 200. We're expecting those to push higher in the coming days. That's the reality as we enter day 2 of this province-wide shutdown. In response to those rising cases, variants, hospitalizations, Dr. Raywat Deonandan is an epidemiologist and science communicator at the University of Ottawa. He joins us this morning to discuss where we're at on this Easter Sunday. Good morning, Dr. Deonandan.
Good morning.
And thanks for joining us. We're now in day 2 of this shutdown. Do you think what we're doing now is enough to stem the tide of this third wave?
No, it's not. If we look at what the actual restrictions entail, we're essentially in what Toronto and Peel were, except you add on you can't go to restaurants. So what we have to do is have an actual stay-at-home order and with enforced limitations on gatherings. And that sounds draconian, I know, but look at the numbers. They're insane. The wastewater analysis in Ottawa is off the charts. We have ICU capacity really strained right now. This third wave is going to be the worst wave, it looks like. And so we need extraordinary initiatives to prevent mass suffering to get us out of this quickly.
And you and others have been making this call for over a week now, looking at the data, seeing that, this is coming. So we have seen, stay-at-home orders put in place in the past. We've seen restrictions put in place in response to rising cases. So what do you think the hesitancy is this time around when seemingly we are getting more people in hospital to issue that stay-at-home order or to issue more draconian restrictions, as you put it?
There are a number of things at play here. First is the tolerance by the people for further restrictions is limited, given that we've been through this for a year now. And as a result, the civilization didn't come to an end because of the disease. And so some people are thinking, it's not as bad as we thought. Why not keep things open? The people who think this way haven't lost loved ones and haven't seen the chaos in the hospital system and haven't thought through the implications of a faltering healthcare system, which is one of the pillars of our society. The other thing, too, is we see what's happening in other parts of the world, like the USA and UK and Israel, and assume that that's us, especially the USA that has enormous vaccine quantities and will be seeing an opening society probably sooner than us. And we're thinking that's us. That's not us. We are not there yet. And the third thing is we have economic considerations that I think are a bit short-sighted, that we need to sustain certain industries in the short term rather than the entire society and economy in the long term. So people can't see the end game. What I think everyone has to understand is this is unlike the previous calls for restrictions. In the past, the pushback was, we can't live like this interminably. And that's true. But guess what? There's an end game in sight now. There's an exit in sight. That exit is vaccination, and it's pretty soon. What we have to do is buy time for vaccination to work. That means holding tight, tightening our belts just for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, so that we can get enough jabs into enough arms so that this ends this spring and never happens again. We can do that. It just means having to restrain ourselves more than ever before in this short period coming.
And how do you think that the province or even health officials, how do you think they get that message through? I know it's been, not a repetitive one, but a somewhat repetitive one in terms of what we need to do to beat the virus. It's pretty simple. We've been reiterating that for a year. So how do you strengthen that message given what we're seeing in Ontario hospitals right now?
Well, I haven't heard anyone actually put it in the terms that I phrased it just now, that this is simply a matter, not simply, but it is kind of simple, simply a matter of just giving time for the vaccines to work. So Dr. Michael Warner, who's just so incredibly quotable, had this pithy tweet earlier in the week that I've been trying to amplify. He said, the third wave was characterized as a race between vaccination and variants, but the variants have won, and now it's a race between vaccination and ICU capacity. Now, the vaccines can still win that race only if we give it an advantage, a head start, right? And that means self-restricting. So that's the message here, is we self-restrict to let the vaccines win, and everybody wins. In the past, it was flatten the curve, and that was seen as a changing target and something that would just rebound again a few weeks later. So the tolerance by some niches in society was not there. But now an actual endpoint can be expressed. And vaccination is a physical thing that's not conceptual. It's there. We just have to go and accept it, and we need time to do so. So I haven't seen that messaging really come forth in media or in social media or really in much conversation, that there's actually a thing we can do now. There's a purpose for the lockdowns. It's to buy time.
Yeah, and Dr. Warner's tweet obviously puts that in fairly stark terms. I guess in terms of the variants making the rounds in the province, do people maybe not understand what like right now? I know during the entire pandemic, that's what we've talked about, lockdowns and shutdowns. It's to make sure that we don't overheat our hospital capacity, the system itself. So do you think people may not understand how bad it is within hospitals right now?
Yeah, that's always been the case. And let's break that down a bit. So a year ago, it's been a year, isn't that amazing? A year ago, we were bracing for the assaults on the hospital system. But guess what? We had canceled elective surgeries. We had a fully staffed healthcare provider roster. We had actually trained some non-frontline workers to present as frontline medical workers if need be. So we're ready. And so the first assault on the healthcare system was not quite as dire. Fast forward 1 year, look at where we are now. We have an overworked, overstressed healthcare worker population. That's many of whom have taken early retirement. Some have died. Some are at home sick or quarantined. We haven't canceled our elective surgeries. We can't, or screening processes, because there's no capacity for that anymore. And we're moving people from places like Toronto to Kingston. And so the headspace, the room for absorbing cases is much diminished now than it was a year ago. And the numbers are misleading too. So when we say we have space in the ICU ward, that's because people have died, or we've moved them out of that vicinity. We moved them from Toronto to Kingston, for example. So that's a misleading situation. So that limited space we have is illusory. That's the nature of the crisis here. And also people don't fully grasp what this means downstream. If the healthcare system can't work, you can't get your, quote unquote elective knee surgery. And when I say elective, I don't mean it's a frivolous optional thing. You need that knee surgery to go back to work. You can't get your cancer screening that will save your life months down the road. So it affects everything. And our society is interwoven with these pillars of support, and healthcare system is one of those things. Now, on top of that, of course, is actual human suffering. This third wave is kind of like a new pandemic within the existing pandemic, because the new variants are the mechanism for the third wave. It's affecting a different demographic. It's more transmissible, as everybody knows, which means you need a lesser exposure to get infected. You need less time exposed to somebody to get infected, and you have a higher probability of being hospitalized and possibly a higher probability of dying. So the human toll is vastly larger as well. And I don't know if that message is getting across, or people are just numb to it now, and those who have never cared will continue to not care. And maybe not caring is a brutal and unfair way of positioning it, but there is a segment of the population that has been inured to the messaging, and I don't see how to get through to them unless they personally are affected, or a loved one is affected by this. And fortunately, a greater number of people are being thus affected daily.
Yeah, and that change in demographics, I did want to ask you about that. Just a quick one on hospitals. What happens when we do run out of capacity here in Ontario? There's only so many intensive care beds here.
Yeah, that's a good question. What happens when we run out? I think you start rationing care, unfortunately. Each individual person who is currently under care gets lesser quality care. Remember, a hospital bed isn't a bed. It's a team of workers. The capacity issue here isn't physical space. It's human beings, right? So a given ICU bed is like a dozen or 17 people who are working on you. So suddenly that drops down to maybe a couple of people working on you. And so the probability of you dying increases each time. There's horrible stories in Europe of people in beds in hallways or in stairwells. It may get to that if we aren't careful. If everything were open now, we would get to that pretty fast. So Canada as a whole is ranked near the bottom of OECD countries with hospital beds per capita. So we never had a lot of capacity to begin with, and we can examine that when this is all over. But we don't have the capacity right now. And it's horrifying. It really is.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think we can all remember some of the shots from Italy, New York City last spring. Some of the issues they were dealing with there, just very, very tough to deal with. In terms of protections, I mentioned, you mentioned actually that you've seen these demographics change. We have seen the 20 to 39 cohorts be more infected with the virus over the course of this third wave. We've been talking about essential workers on the show in terms of that age group, and do we need more protections for essential workers? But even those younger, 20 to 39, do we need to be re-examining who's getting vaccines, how we're kind of protecting younger people as well during this pandemic?
I think we do. Now, it's fashionable to scold younger people by saying, hey, young people, stop having parties. And, some are, and they need to be scolded. But a large number are essential workers, or grocery clerks, or baristas. They live in group housing. They cannot socially distance. So now they're at risk, and we have to give them the tools to protect themselves. Now, having a blanket vaccination drive for 20-year-olds probably isn't the best way to use our limited vaccine capacity, but we can target them towards those postal codes or those areas where we have the highest amount of risk, and also those occupations. So factory workers, people who cannot work from home have to be protected. Now, to a large extent, those are younger people, between like 20 to 50 or so. So those, I think, that's where we have to target the vaccines right now. People who cannot stay home. People who keep our society running. Our Amazon workers, our postal delivery people, teachers. If schools aren't going to close, we got to give jobs to teachers. So yeah, it's no longer a situation of delivering vaccine by age strata. Now we go to where the fire is hottest and use our limited water sparingly in that sense.
And how quickly should the province be pivoting on that point?
I think it has to happen right away, especially given that we have vaccine appointments not being filled, people not showing up. Well, okay, then give those vaccines to essential workers. Stat. That's if we didn't have a crisis, I would say continue with the age strata delivery. But we do have a crisis. We have to put out the emergency right now and then return to the age stratification approach when we have more breathing space. But we're in crisis now. We're in emergency.
You're using words crisis and emergency. We also talked about, the economic considerations that have been taken into effect. Do you think those need to take a back seat right now?
That's a tough question. Now, I think it's important to note that those countries that controlled COVID well and hard and early are now doing economically quite well. Relatively speaking, of course, like New Zealand, Australia, Bhutan, even Uruguay, the Southeast Asian countries. So if we control COVID quickly, we can get back on an economic footing faster, in my non-expert opinion. I'm not an economist, right? So what it means for our actual businesses on the ground, our restaurants that are closing, of course, I feel for them. That means we have to support them while we close things down. We have to direct taxpayer funding to keep these businesses in fluidity while these closures take place. That is the right thing to do and the rational thing to do and the democratic thing to do. So to me, it's not a difficult choice. We do what we can to control the disease, we support people who are affected by the closures, and we get back on our feet faster.
Yeah, just last one for you. I guess similar to the economic question, but I guess we've seen this lockdown being put in place. Do these work? Do the lockdowns work? I think that's the question that a number of people are asking right now, just considering that we have seen a rise in cases. What do you tell people that are doubting the efficacy of these lockdowns?
Of course they work. The data is pretty clear. Everywhere around the world, we've enacted economic restrictions. The cases go down. The problem is they don't lock down hard enough or long enough to get the cases down to the point where we can keep them down. So every time we've done it in Ontario, it's worked. That's why we have these waves, is we drive a wave down by having something resembling a lockdown. Of course they work, right? So the pushback is always, yeah, but the disease is still here because you didn't do it long enough, right? COVID-0 as a strategy was a lockdown long enough to drive it to the ground. We haven't done that.
No, we've seen the Atlantic provinces tried that approach in New Zealand as well. They've done that too, but we've moved to a mitigation approach and it hasn't worked as well. We'll leave it there, Dr. Deonandan. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it today.
Thank you.